to introduce the topic, I think it'll be a great idea to talk about the thought experiment that's known as the Byzantine generals problem. So what is the Byzantine generals problem? How does it link with decentralization?
Absolutely. So imagine a scenario when you have a few groups of people, and each group of people wants to do something different. So say, for instance, you have 5, and this was the initial idea of the Byzantine general problem, is say you have 5 warriors, and there are 2 groups, or there are 2 ideas that you can either go and attack or raid sort of this building, or you can retreat and wait for another time. And the options there you have binary solutions to them. So if you retreat, you must all retreat together, else the people attacking will lose their lives or probably be defeated. Or if you attack, then you should attack in solidarity, so that there is this, like we talked about earlier, this network effect of everyone collaborating to the effort, and so the effect is multiplied a little bit. However, there can be times where if you have a centralized authority, you might have this issue that someone is demotivated by that centralized authority and chooses to do something different. Excuse me. And in this case, if one person defects from the overall objective, then it becomes harder for the 5 people or the 4 people left behind to go ahead and proceed with the attack, or go ahead or retreat. And this can also be understood in a different sense, and we'll come to decentralization now, is say if you had 2 groups of people, so 2 different nodes, who were sort of the central authority, so they commanded their own respective groups. So you can think of them as sub-generals almost. And then you had the 5th person who was in an equivalent rank, and to please both the sub-generals, because he or she or they wanted to become the new sub-general, they agreed upon what the sub-generals wanted. So one sub-general wanted to attack, one sub-general wanted to retreat. So two groups, 2 people wanted to attack, 2 wanted to retreat, and the 5th person who wanted to please the sub-generals decided to send what the sub-generals were doing to both the sub-generals. So he or she or they said to the first one, okay, we will attack, and said to the second that when we will retreat. And when that happens, the first sub-general thought that 3 people wanted to attack, and thus the majority was convinced, and so the attack will carry forward. The second sub-general thought that 3 people said that they'll retreat, and thus they assumed that the majority convinced everyone to retreat, and thus each of the sub-generals thought that they have the entire group following them. However, what happened is each of the sub-generals lost their sort of army, or the one person following them. And this is sort of the Byzantine generals problem, is that if you have a faulty node or a faulty idea, it can create an illusion of multiple answers. And in this case, that multiple answers, this illusion was both attack and retreat at the same time. So you can almost think of it as the idea of the idea that scientist Schrödinger had of this illusion of yes and no, or the presence or the unpresence of a cat in a box almost. And moving on from centralization to distributed responsibility, is distributed responsibility can help solve this problem using a variety of different ways. And we'll touch upon the most basic ways. One is the idea of signatures. So in the internet, there is this idea of digital signatures, or cryptographic digital signatures. And if you can somehow prove to me that you gave me the message that you gave to the other person as well, then I can be certain that the person who was pleasing or trying to please both the sub-generals did not have multiple answers, only had one answer. And this only holds if 2/3 of all present nodes are not corrupted. So what that means is, if more than 2/3 of all nodes are correct, the distributed system will hold. And we can run through why this is the case. So let's assume that this is not the case, and we have one failed node and we have 2 correct nodes. So in this case, the correct nodes is less than 2/3. And what happens then is, say A is the faulty node, A tells B to attack, A tells C to retreat, but then B can go to C and say that A told me to attack. But C has no way to verify that B is correct or not, because it only has one hearsay from B. But imagine if you have A, B, C, and D, then C is receiving a message from B and D about A, and thus can confirm if the message makes sense or not. And so anytime the distributed system has more than 2/3 of the nodes correct, you are less likely to run into the Byzantine generals problem. And that is called the Byzantine Fault. And so that can be avoided. So there are other more complex theories on how you can solve the Byzantine Fault issue. And we've come to a stage where even less than 2/3 of correct nodes will still result in a Byzantine network being, or in a network being correct and away from Byzantine fault. And that's to do more with something called hashing. We can investigate the issue a little bit more in detail, but I don't want to spend too much time. But the idea is, in a subgeneral, the subgeneral produces a message. Each of the subgeneral's followers somehow checks that the message is correct or not. And then after the checking, sends a reply saying, we have checked and verified the subgeneral's message and the message is correct. And that's sort of the idea of hashing. It's slightly more complex, and it has to do with public and private keys. And we can delve into that a little bit later. But that's sort of the idea of distributed systems coming from the Byzantine generals problem.